Okay. I'm Jim Pinkerton.
Great. My name is Chloe Breyer. I am an Episcopal priest in the Diocese of New York and direct something called the Interfaith Center of New York that works with religious leaders all around the city on bringing them together around practical issues that concern their congregations, from foreclosures to domestic violence and everything in between.
Wow, that's plenty right there. But you also have larger thoughts. I'm told.
I do have larger thoughts. Having been here in New York over 9/11, I worked, as many ordained people did, as a chaplain down at the World Trade Center and at the morgues, and went from there actually to Afghanistan, where our bishop helped to lead a interfaith effort to rebuild a mosque in north of Kabul in the Shimali Plain, to sort of put real flesh on those words that our government had said following 9/11, which is that we are not in a war against Islam. And we thought it'd be nice to rebuild a mosque that our government had actually bombed inadvertently in the campaign in November, and have gone back 4 or 5 times since then to work on some reconstruction efforts. And in addition, I am part of a group called Episcopalians for Global Reconciliation, which is working to bring the Millennium Development Goals to the consciousness of our churches and other people of faith around the country in terms of our commitment to the global poor. So I do try to get out and about a bit, which I know you do as well, Jim. So.
Wow,
yeah.
that sounds very Episcopalian. And
you say that with yes. That's a title I will embrace. But go on.
Well, I confess that I count myself as a Christian.
Yes.
And have had, like all Americans after 9/11, we've had to reflect on sort of how America should conduct itself in the world, and I counted myself as a supporter of the Afghanistan intervention, which I saw as just basically sort of a punitive action against the Taliban back in late 2001. Although it's sort of harder and harder for me to see what good we're doing there nowadays, as the war grinds on. I was an opponent of the Iraq War before, during, after.
Right.
Although I now think that we're sort of stuck in a way that requires us to think of some kind of Nixonian exit strategy of sort of peace with honor and so on. I really don't think that we can afford to just withdraw. But what do the Episcopalians say about that, or what do you say about that? Whether or not you're speaking to the Episcopalian Church or not.
Well, I wouldn't dare to venture to speak for the whole of my church. As you know, we're across the board on a number of issues, but certainly I was a strong opponent, as were members of my congregation in West Harlem, against the war in Iraq, and continue to be so. I'm with you, however, on the question of an exit strategy and our obligations to continue to work, particularly for those people who have struggled on our behalf. I'm thinking of the translators. I'm thinking of people who put themselves out on the limb for the American military, to be quite honest, and are now in grave danger because of that. And getting our act together in terms of getting rid of those State Department loopholes to bring people, give them asylum, it seems to be an important part of getting out of Iraq and pretending, not continuing to pretend that we're winning over there. That would seem one of the important first steps that we would do. I feel quite differently around Afghanistan, which, as you remember, was an international initiative that we joined partners from NATO and around the world in that intervention, and made promises at the Bonn Convention to give money and help in rebuilding, which we have fallen down on abysmally. And the U.S. people and our government need to get together in terms of fulfilling our commitment to the rebuilding efforts that have sort of fallen by the wayside in Afghanistan. And that, I think, is a really important thing. as well. Which
I agree. I certainly agree. We've made a bunch of commitments and undertook some responsibilities that we have to deal with in a constructive way. I am curious, though, if you're 2 points. One is if you're in West Harlem, then A, you have a lot of just parishioners by definition, and B, you also must be somewhere near Columbia University.
That's right. We both.
And so, just between those two things, I mean, do you have members of your parish who've been to Iraq and combat? I mean, out of the National Guard, or what? I mean, has anybody been killed?
We're fortunate that in terms of members of our congregation, there's certainly relatives who have been serving over in Iraq. We had the daughter of one of our congregants who was in Germany, and also over in Afghanistan. So in terms of casualties, we have not, luckily, have had a direct hit, as it were. But it's a big source of conflict and concern. We also are proud to have a member of the Grannies Against the War, a group of young at heart over the age of 75 who went down to Times Square to enlist a couple months back to save our younger people from having to face the real tragic situations of serving over there, and then coming back to a country that doesn't seem to pay attention to their politically to their psychological needs as well as their physical ones. So we've got in our congregation folks who both serve and also who protest against the war.
What happened to the granny when she tried to enlist?
She was arrested.
Seriously?
She sure was. There are pictures of her and several other grannies who were taken off in plastic handcuffs.
For disturbing the peace?
For disturbing the peace, that's right.
Wow.
For sitting down.
We post links here at Blogging Heads, at least somebody does, and that would be a good one if you have some pictures. I'm sure I was not aware of that incident.
Okay.
Wow.
There you go.
So what about Columbia University? What's the mood there?
Well, Columbia, the big local concern right now is that Columbia is planning a big expansion into the neighborhood of West Harlem. This probably doesn't make the national news, but it has major impacts for the neighborhood where 1 in 4 children suffer from asthma, one of the highest rates in the country. We're talking about a major construction effort in a several square block radius north of 125th Street that will have major implications to the health of the neighborhood. Also, the gentrification issue as real estate values rise and the poor are really driven out of Manhattan. The guy I work with refers to Manhattan now as a gated community. I don't know if that sort of looks like the direction that we're going in many ways. So that's a big issue of local concern. Columbia has also made the headlines in terms of a visit from the Iranian president. As you remember, that was a somewhat controversial move. And I think they have a delegation of professors who've gone over there to apologize. I don't know if they made it back or not. I'm not quite up on that.
To apologize to whom?
Job.
They want to apologize to him?
They want to apologize, I believe, for the words, the lack of welcome that was given, sort of give with one hand, take away from the other. It was the president was quite critical, as he should have been, I believe, in terms of the president of Iran's human rights record. There was some question about that.
That is interesting that the mere fact that Ahmadinejad was invited at all there by, I guess his name is President Bollinger, caused quite a ruckus, and so I guess then the feeling was that Bollinger sort of had to sort of dump on Ahmadinejad just to sort of make up for it, but I guess he went too far for the Edward Said constituency around there. Okay, fair enough. Interesting.
So there we are. That's the update from the Columbia West Harlem part of the neighborhood. But that's one part of the globe. There are other parts as well.
Well, there are certainly other parts, and I must say that I believe that the prophet who hasn't gotten enough honor for kind of explaining what's happening, not that it's necessarily desirable, but certainly is working out that way, is Samuel Huntington. I think that the feeling among a lot of Americans that we were one 82nd Airborne strike away from transforming Afghanistan and then Iraq, and maybe in the future Iran, into some pro-Western, democracy, I think has had sort of a thudding collision with reality. And I think that, by the same token, the feeling that we're all sort of naturally, spontaneously brothers and sisters sort of ended on 9/11. So I think we're in kind of a bleak period now, where, for lack of a better word, reality is kind of telling us that we're going to be in for a very long and difficult time with Islam, just because there are lots of grievances and lots of disputes and fights and everything else. And I just don't see a happy outcome anytime soon.
Well, it depends where you think the front lines are in this so-called war of civilizations. I think that Samuel Huntington, I would not describe him as a prophet. I would describe him as someone who sort of saw and drew out something that clearly parts of which are true, as in any stereotype. But I'm not sure that prophetic I associate a reserve for folks like Amos and Isaiah, who will not only call the future but decide what it is that will bring God's people into dialogue again with God. And usually it has to do with being nice to widows and orphans, as I recall, which is not part of the Huntington thesis. That being that as it may, it depends again where you think the front lines of this so-called division or war of civilizations. It's certainly an encounter, and whether we make it a war or a dialogue, I think is within our own hands.
What about their hands?
Well, I think it takes it's certainly in their hands too. You're quite right about that. And that's again where I suggest that we need to look at where we believe the front lines are. You can look to the fields of Afghanistan and Iraq as somehow where the military encounters as being the main place where this encounter takes place. I think that's a mistake. And I think that we here at the Interfaith Center of New York, and many places, particularly in the urban centers of the West, where a lot of encounter of civilization takes place that doesn't perhaps make the headlines so much. I'm thinking about the New Yorks, the Londons, the Parises, of our quote-unquote Western world, which due to globalization and immigration patterns are a far more diverse group than, or diverse sites than I think we give ourselves credit for. And some of the work that we do here at the Interfaith Center is working with religious leaders, particularly of immigrant communities from South Asia, from the Arab states, and looking at those religious leaders and putting them into dialogue with each other and with city officials, from judges to social workers and teachers, and saying in that encounter that you can maintain your religious identity and also become an active participant in a pluralistic democracy at the same time. I think if we did a little bit more of this work, we'd find that the front lines are as much in our own communities and how good a job we do here in the West with inviting people who are coming here to view themselves as active participants in our own civilization and democracy as anything else that we could possibly do. And I don't know if you agree with that or not, because you've written.
Well, let's talk about some more front lines here. How about Lebanon? How do you interpret what's going on there right now?
Lebanon is a pretty good mess. I would say that's for sure. And again, I know more about what we can do inside these cities of ours, which are, I would think we have to take a kind of an ownership look at and look at as how are we in terms of our own government and our own as a religious leader. I can also speak for, I hope, for some of my own religious community. What are we doing that advocates policies that are hospitable for the changing landscape and changing demographics of our cities?
Okay, I mean, I'm all for cities, people getting along and dialogue and working on things together and so on.
Really?
That's what you have to do to make a country, e pluribus unum, to coin a phrase.
Yeah.
I do have a question about the wisdom of further immigration into the United States from Muslim countries. I worry that what's happened in Paris and the Banlieues and so on,
Yeah.
and the enormous internal security problem that they have all across Europe now, I think that probably this is a good occasion for offense, if in part because it would appear that countries or areas with a Muslim majority tend not to be small d democratic or liberal and pluralistic. And Lebanon is a kind of a sobering example. Pakistan, which has gone back and forth on being democratic at one time or another. I think that there is a massive wave of Islamic, radicalism is probably too loaded a word, but purification, reformation going on, and I guess I feel pretty strongly that we can't stop them from doing what they want to do in their country, but I think we can stop them from importing it into our country, or our country's plural. I would hate to think that, like with the London experience, with the subway bombing, or the Madrid experience, and any number of sort of plots and schemes and that have been attempted, then thankfully been thwarted, I would worry about more of that coming here. And so I would my instinct would be to kind of put a lid on the number of encounters that we're having with Islam inside the West.
Really, because it's interesting you say that, because according to Imam Faisal Rauf, who's the author of What's Right with Islam, and many other folks, he's actually on our board of directors. But there's a big feeling afoot that actually the future of Islam is in the United States in terms of embracing an Islam which looks at its pluralistic roots, that embraces the kind of dialogue between and within itself, that actually what's most exciting about the future of Islam is happening right here in the U.S. And if you look around the world, I think you also see a diversity of political arrangements in Muslim states. You look at Indonesia as an example, where there is a vast diversity of peoples that have somehow under a Muslim constitution managed to live with sizable Christian minorities. So I think there is some diversity even around the political makeup of Muslim countries around the world.
There's some, but look at let's leave the really hard cases like Saudi Arabia and Sudan
Sure.
and Iraq and Iran off the table for a moment, and just talk like Bangladesh. I don't consider Bangladesh to be a terribly free or pluralistic country anymore.
Well, yeah, it's
I think
one, but yes, go on.
But I think that it's. It would seem to me that most Muslims would probably say that the heart of Islam is from Mecca and Medina and Saudi Arabia and so on. It's literally the heart of it, the founding place of it, the fonts. That there's Jerusalem, if you will. And I think most of the trends in terms of inter-Western dialogue, and it's not just me as a blue-eyed European thinking that. I expect the Indians, having just experienced a string of bombings, just in India, I think just yesterday, and I don't know this exactly clear who set those bombs off, but if the pattern holds, it's going to be what Samuel Huntington called the bloody borders of Islam over Kashmir. Now again, I don't even have an opinion on who should own Kashmir. I'm not even going to get into the politics of it. Just to sort of say that if you look around from Kashmir to Chechnya to the interfaces with Europe, there seems to be more conflict, or a lot of conflict, than anything else, and I just question the wisdom about deliberately, consciously creating that sort of multiculturalism as opposed to multi-ethnicity inside the West.
I am curious about that, because you also mentioned the thwarted cases, and just again speaking from a practical perspective, since as a Christian, I'm not sure I feel equipped to go into the intricacies of true Islam or not. But just from a practical, speaking as a U.S. citizen, I think that many of the cases of thwarted attempts, at least in our country, have been due to good relationships that have been formed with members of the Muslim community themselves. And that should you begin a I'm not even sure, how one would begin at what sounds like a somewhat draconian idea of creating walls based on people's ethnic backgrounds or religions. But should you even try to discourage immigration to the U.S. from parts of the world that are predominantly Muslim or Arab ethnicity, you then run the risk that you start to alienate those people who are the ones that you rely on when it comes to thwarting plots from the extremist few.
Or you Americanize them. Because that's what we did with all the ethnicities that came to America 100 years ago.
Sure.
We said in no nonsense, in very strict terms, look, this is your American flag. These are your pilgrim ancestors, even if you just got off the boat from Italy or Germany, 10 minutes ago. And I think Teddy Roosevelt, was a great president who spoke very intensely about, look, we're not going to have a United States of America anymore if we don't take affirmative steps at patriotic assimilation.
Okay, so this is where the rubber hits the road. Depends what you think is true Americanization. I'll argue, I want to give you a little story of an imam, Afghan imam I know from Queens, who came here escaping the Taliban back in the 90s and was the imam of the largest Muslim mosque in North America over in Flushing. He has, he helped us raise the money to rebuild over in Afghanistan, but he also, through certification from the correctional system in New York City, has begun to serve as a volunteer chaplain at a jail on Staten Island. Suddenly he moves from, not because he's plastered with American flags or refuses to disagree with the U.S. government, which too often becomes litmus tests for whether or not you're American. Instead, what I would argue is the greatest Americanization of this imam is his ability to then go to do his job as a chaplain. Suddenly he moves from being a chaplain of Afghans only, or an imam of Afghans only. He becomes the chaplain, Muslim chaplain, in a jail in Staten Island, and all of a sudden he's imam to Pakistanis, to Afghans, to Nigerians, to white American Caucasians who are Muslim. He is suddenly the imam of a multiple group of people, all in jail. But he views himself in this larger way as somebody who is the religious leader for a whole bunch of people with different ethnicities and backgrounds. And I would say this is the experience of what it means to be an American. Someone who suddenly, as a religious leader, sees yourself serving a variety of peoples, of backgrounds. It doesn't have anything to do with whether you swear, you promise never to disagree with our government. That is something that is not American, or the American.
I agree that the glory of this country is the melting pot and the fact that people can come here. But I think that practical political science tells you that you don't have a country. A country, you can have the Muslim Ummah, you could even have Christendom, but you won't have a nation if you don't have some common fealty to a few core things. The flag, a little bit of patriotism, and I would even say the English language. If this is America, if it were Saudi Arabia, it would be the Arabic language. I mean, if it would be Russia, it would be the Russian language. If you don't have those things, I think that what sort of I think is sunk into the celebrants of multiculturalism as they emerged, in the 50s and 60s, were the experiences of Lebanon, Yugoslavia, the former Soviet Union. Even Canada and Quebec, where, as what Michael Novak calls the unmeltable ethnics, just don't melt very well. And so what statecraft requires you to do is say, listen, this is great that the imam from Afghanistan deals with his and fellow Muslims all across the spectrum of Islam, but one of the reasons why they're doing that is because the Nigerians, whether they're in prison or wherever, don't have immediate access to a Nigerian imam because they're not enough coming over, and so you have to make do with a non-Nigerian. That's actually part of the process of sort of squeezing the supply, if you will, so that we force people in the best sense of we're all becoming one nation. We're abandoning old allegiances and taking up new allegiances. We're forswearing all foreign leaders. of these foreign political leaders. That's part of the process. That's part of the wisdom of an America of 300 million Americans as opposed to 500 million people or 800 million or a billion people scattered from all over the world, which I think would just collapse into your choice, Lebanon, Yugoslavia, Kashmir, any number of places that are riven with seemingly permanent wars.
It sounds like we're not disagreeing too much. My concern, though, is the shorthand that we use for what it means to be American, because I think that too often we talk about patriotism and the shorthand becomes a kind of blind agreement, or there's tension in becoming an American and tension in being a true patriot. And I think that our both media and a kind of national ethos since 9/11, a kind of knee-jerk patriotism, doesn't do that justice. And I
agree with that. I agree with that completely. Arguing is fine, but there's got to be some sense that when it's all over, we're still in the same country, and that's not the case. As we're seeing it right before our eyes in Lebanon right now, I don't think that the Hezbollah have any intention of allowing the Sunnis and the Christians and the Druze to have any significant role in Lebanon when they get done.
I think that's probably that may be the case, and I don't. That's ground that I'm certainly a lot less. Have a lot less good opinions on. Not that anyone's asking me, but I think that is a very difficult and unfortunate situation, and we're currently, I think. I know that you've written about. I would like actually to talk a little bit, perhaps changing the subject a bit towards this sense in which we as Christians, I think we'll share that word in common. Do we have any special obligations vis-a-vis our own government and our own foreign policies when it comes to not just the question of what you do when people come here, but what we as a nation are what we need to do with stuff that happens over there? I don't know if you've written a bit from the American conservative on the topic of Christendom, and I don't know if you could share a little bit about that.
Right. I mean, first of all, Christians, and I'm at a church where they're sending missions out all the time, and so on. They're working closely with a black church here in the District of Columbia. Nobody needs me to just offer a thumbs up to all the charitable efforts that have so defined the best of Christianity over the eons and so on. So again, and I think these sort of spontaneous, the free marketeer in me says lots of people trying lots of different things, is to be very much admired. Who knows what the right solution is, and who knows, I humble myself before those, including you, who are willing to really, get into the community and deal with problems like drinking and domestic violence and substance abuse and so on. It's hard enough for me to get along with my own family, let alone trying to get in the middle of everybody else's family. That's the best of Christianity to me. What I have struggled with is, as Martin Luther said, we must be lit as an enlightened by the light of faith, which Christians, not that Christians all agree on anything, but that's at least there's some obvious points there to be made about, the golden rule and so on, and give your coat and, turn the other cheek and things that we strive to live by. And he also said we should be enlightened by the light of reason. And I guess that's probably more the Washingtonian in me, the Politico in me says, okay, if you've been given, or if you've taken, however you want to define it, and you now find yourself in possession of a piece of territory, what should we do? And the Christian in me says, well, people should have health care, and there should be clean air and clean water, and they should be safe from depredation either by criminals or for that matter by the government. I think you and I could probably agree on 9/10 of what a Christian society would look like, including tolerance for non-Christians and all those things. I think we might even agree that injecting too much of Hezbollah into the United States would not be a good thing. So what I tried to do in the cover story in the American Conservative last summer was to sort of think through taking one of my favorite authors from my childhood, J.R.R. Tolkien, the author of the Lord of the Rings trilogy and various other books, and sort of think to myself, well, what sort of messages? And Tolkien wrote in a private letter in the early 50s that, well, of course, Lord of the Rings is, as he said, intensely Catholic. Now, I realize not all Christians are Catholics, and I'm actually not a Catholic either, but nonetheless, I just thought it was interesting that he was so conscious of his religious impulses as he was writing those books, even though, of course, Christianity per se is not mentioned at all in them. And what I kind of came away with, as I thought about it more, was, well, look, there is a certain degree to which, if you have a community that you want to protect, you have to protect it. And what struck me was, if present trends continue, I worry that one day we're going to wake up, or at least, if not us personally, at least our descendants, are going to wake up and find that, like the Vatican, has been dynamited. I was very sobered by the demolition of those statues, in those Buddhist statues in Bamiyan, Afghanistan, in the summer of 2001 by the Taliban. And I certainly understand that the Taliban doesn't speak for all Muslims. They spoke for enough of them to take over Afghanistan, that's for sure, and to dynamite those ancient Buddhist statues. And I thought, well, what would happen if they could do that to the Vatican in Italy? Or what could happen if they could do that to Jerusalem? Places that, frankly, I care more about as a Christian. And I thought, well, we ought not to let that happen. And that led me to sort of reflect on why it is, or how it came to be, that Christendom is divided into sort of four big blocks of the 2.2 billion or so Christians around the world. You can identifiably say, look, there's the West, which is just in shorthand, sort of Europe and America. And not particularly, a lot of them are post-Christian, a lot of them never were Christians, but there's an identifiable Christianity, historically there, and obviously active in certain places, especially in America. Another block is Africa. There's several hundred million African Christians. They're Christians. They're a big part of the Episcopal Church, as I'm sure you're conscious of. But they're certainly a different culture and everything else than the West. Another area is Latin America. Again, Christians, but just culturally very much different. And the fourth one is Russia, and again, a different civilization. And there's a few others you could point to, like Ethiopia and so on. They're just different. But I thought to myself, isn't it interesting that those four subsets of Christendom are divided, oftentimes hostile, many wars between them at various times, and so on and so on. And the problem comes if you find yourself in, and I believe this at least, in a Huntingtonian struggle of civilizations. And by the way, I don't want a war. Nothing that I'm saying advocates war with anybody, but it does argue, in the spirit of Tolkien, self-defense. It does argue a clear-eyed realization that not everybody in the world likes America, that some people want to get their revenge on us for things we've done to them. Some people are just jealous. Some people are just ambitious. There's plenty of reasons why people go to war, but you need to be ready militarily and sort of socially and economically for any of those challenges. And so I just said, look, what clearly needs to happen is that the West, the Christendom, needs to unite in some form to agree on certain things, one of which is self-defense and some sort of sense of destiny and autonomy as a way of dealing with the rest of the world. Now, that's what I wrote, and I called it the Once and Future Christendom, because I do believe there's a huge tradition of Christian political science, a lot of it going back to Constantine and Eusebius, who was a sort of a politico of the 4th century. These people did think through about how are you going to keep the Roman Empire together in the face of the onslaught. Obviously, they failed, although, of course, one could say that in losing the Roman Empire, even if it was Christian, they gained the rest of Europe.
So that brings up, so you're defining Christendom in a political terms, as a political
yes.
term.
Right. Right.
So,
In the same way, by the way, that I think Muslims define Islam, the Muslim areas, as in their political terms. I think you just have to deal with the definitions that are not only what we think, but also what they think.
Right, and I think that's part of the issue. And again, my speaking not as a Muslim myself, again, I want to qualify that. But I think that, again, one of the things that Imam Faisal writes about is the incompatibility of speaking in terms of what's un-Christian versus what's un-Islamic, and that perhaps a better translation from our perspective as non-Muslims is to think about that term un-Islamic as reading something like unconstitutional. In other words, that we're perhaps not totally parallel, if you want to think in those political terms. The Prophet Muhammad having lived a much longer life than Jesus, and having to encounter those questions, some of those questions of statecraft, which Jesus Christ did not encounter. And that in terms of what we've had to say about the political decisions of for want of a better word, what the body politic has to do, I think is not totally parallel. And I guess I would have a lot of thoughts about that. But one of the things I would question is are we at our strongest when we're looking to examples of Constantine for definitions of what it means to be Christian, or do we look to those first 3 centuries where the Christian community was very much about being a far more alternative and subversive entity that really questioned the very definition of empire itself? And if we were to look today, then where would we find those people? Are they ones that are figuring out how for the American empire to maintain its hold, or would they be the ones questioning the very premise of American empire? And what does think of Paul's letters to the Romans and his advice that he gives those Christians living in the heart of the empire at the time. What would that letter say to us today? And would it have us, trying to define the kind of best way to quote unquote defend ourselves in an age of empire facing threats, or would it give us advice about how to live as a faithful person within our own, as citizens of this empire? So. Sorry, that's those are good questions, and again, it's hard to. I suspect St. Paul would be, given, and the early Christians, for exactly the reasons you suggest, they were critics of these things as opposed to supporters. That's for sure. But on the other hand, when the time comes, like for example, in the early wasn't that long after Constantine that Attila the Hun showed up, right? And he had the intention of killing them all. So St. Gregory, if I recall, had to go out and face Attila the Hun down, and this is, I'm sure the actual historical events of the mid-5th century are a little bit, shrouded, and who knows exactly what sort of spiritual power Pope Gregory used to keep Attila the Hun from ransacking Italy, although of course he then went on to ransack France until he was finally defeated by a Christian army and pushed back. Look, there's plenty of opportunity for a fertile discussion, about how Christian faith can change things, whether it's Martin Luther King or in America's conscience, or Pope John Paul II, sort of facing down the Soviets and the communists. I guess my concern is, and my hope is, that people of goodwill who really want to make a country or a community or a world a better place can figure out how to do it if they aren't being actively conquered by somebody else. But really, who says that when they commit an act of war aren't doing it in self-defense? The history of just war seems to be everybody explaining to themselves why what they're doing is really in their self-defense. I mean, I think that self-defense is such a kind of, as far as the just war litmus test, all that was very much explained in the in the entree into Iraq. We're doing this to protect ourselves because we are imminently facing this threat of WMD. There's very few wars that can't be explained in terms of the aggressor's view. They're being defending themselves. So I just say, let's not call that Christian. Let's use some other term, but let's not call it Christian.
But let's make the point, and that is that saying we're Christians or not Christians doesn't solve the problem, because plenty of Christians have committed plenty of horrible atrocities and aggressions and so on in the name of just war, for all the reasons you say, which is why we need a framework of law and common sense and political science. The old phrase, and I'll get my Latin wrong here, cuius regio ius religio, his region, his religion, which dates from the 16th to 17th century somewhere, and I used to know who said it. There's some, I think a Jesuit or some sort of international lawyer of that era.
Yep.
You have to have some way of saying, look, if we want to be Christians, to take one example, and Saudi Arabia says you can't have a church, you can't even take a Bible into the country, well, then that's not so good for the Christian faith. So we can't have Wahhabism, in America, at least in a dominant position. And I do think that the work of Stephen Schwartz and so on has kind of given me some pause about the role of the Wahhabis and the Saudi Arabians, around the world, and how they're trying to radicalize Islam and stuff like that. And I think that the reality that happens is, if you look at what the political transformations that are going on in places like Iraq and Iran over the last 30 years, and the Taliban and Afghanistan, where something tells me the Taliban is going to wind up winning, and quite possibly Pakistan. And some of these, the former Soviet stands, I confess I don't know much about. I worry enormously that if these trends, which are difficult, if not impossible to stop, on their territory could somehow expand to our territory, we wouldn't be free to have this conversation, and you'd be wearing a burqa, and neither of us would be going to a Christian church. So I do think at some point you have to say, look, it's fun to have discussions about what a Christian ought to do in terms of helping thy neighbor and loving thy neighbor and so on. But there's also just a tradition that I think is firmly embedded in Christianity and Judeo-Christianity about, look, every now and then you have to fight, every now and then you have to defend yourself, but you do have to be wise. Again, I think we agreed on, I know we did, on the Iraq War. I suspect we agree on the Iran war that many people are pushing. So let's hope that we can develop out of our common commitment to those things which we agree on some kind of political science tradition that gives us some reasonable, rational way of surviving the world without getting into wars all the time.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, I'm curious to learn a little bit more about the his region, his religion. Tell me a bit more about that, and why.
It was basically a way of settling the Reformation. There was at some point you had to stop saying, look, are we going to spend all our time killing each other over Catholic versus Protestant? And so we'll simply sort of say, look, we're just going to look. This is Catholic, this is Protestant, and that's that. And that's nobody's idea. It's not the ACLU's. It's not James Madison's idea or Thomas Jefferson's of a wonderful solution. But it becomes at least the beginning of something where you can stop the active carnage that so disfigured the entire 16th century.
So it's the closest equivalent right now seems to be Iraq itself.
Right, exactly. I think that a pretty good solution to what's going on in Iraq right now is partition. I've said that all along. Something tells me that the Kurds, the Sunnis, and the Shias are going to end up in separate somethings, cantons, if not countries, and that will be the beginning of a ceasefire, which will be progress from where they are now.
But it's I think from a from the perspective that we were talking about, that is a defeat. I mean, that's that's failure. Yeah, the minute that you do have to build walls, you've lost it, really. And
better being killed, a better wall than dead.
Well,
to coin a phrase.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm serious. I mean, I'm not. I mean, I think that look, at some point, and I'm, the Israelis wanted the Palestinians to stop sending suicide bombers into Israel proper. They were better off building a wall. Now, I think that there should be a peace deal, and I think that the Palestinians should have their own country, et cetera, et cetera. And I think there should be international guarantees every which way, and I think that's actually, I wrote about that in my American Conservative piece, that ought to be one of the projects, that the Christians and the Muslims sit down and have sort of come up with some sort of settlement. That's, But I think that in the short run, in Harlem, at any given moment, you're glad that you've got a wall between you and some, urban marauder out there. It's just common sense says self-defense has got to be part of any equation for civilization.
Yeah, I guess, and again, that goes back to the question, which I'd be curious to think about it a little bit more, of what you think is in your long-term self-defense versus what is in the short-term, because, perhaps if we paid a bit more attention to the Geneva Conventions, for example, as a country, and thought a bit about whether the treatment of folks who are currently in Guantanamo might have implications for how the U.S. is viewed in the rest of the world, and what might be the long-term impacts of creating foreign policy that, in the eyes of the rest of the world, makes us the foremost aggressor, as opposed to a entity or country acting in its own self-defense. I think there'd probably be some disagreement there as well. What is it that?
And I'm not sure there would, actually, because I wrote a piece of all places, the Jerusalem Post, in January 2003 at the absolute peak of pro-war fervor. Not only in America but also in Israel on the eve of the Iraq War, and the example I used to illustrate my point about what's going to happen was Isaiah Berlin's famous essay on the German counter-Enlightenment. As Isaiah Berlin wrote back in, I guess, probably the 50s, look, when the French came into the Rhineland and elsewhere in Germany in the 1790s, preaching, liberty, fraternity, equality, and planting liberty trees and stuff, all the Germans who were sick and tired of their own, princes and, little petty autocrats and stuff, were happy. And that lasted about 10 years until the Germans decided that their own petty dictators and autocrats were better than the French coming in, and with all their theories, which seemed to be sort of self-serving and ultimately aggrandizing for France. And so this is Berlin talking now, the German counter-enlightenment. They said, listen, if this is what enlightenment is, we're for counter-enlightenment. And so people who are sort of forgotten by history now, like Herder and Fichte and so on, got up and said, look, we've got to get rid of these French. And the next 150 years of European history were spent working through the German reaction to the French invasion of that time. Now, plenty of people could argue this history back and forth and so on, but I'm just using it as an illustration. I have no doubt in my mind that 50, 100 years from now, some Iraqi or Afghan or Iranian or Palestinian or whatever is going to say, listen, the reason that my parents or family got killed or tortured or whatever was by some American cluster bomb or who knows what, that we're going to have hell to pay in our own territory as a result. I was very strongly opposed to the Iraq War. I wrote this in warning. I did the best I could. But now I think there's no question, and I include Guantanamo. I mean, there are no illusions about how Guantanamo plays in the Muslim world, and I would just say, in addition to closing it down and figuring something else out to do, that folks, we've got, as Thomas Jefferson said, a wolf by the ears here, and we better have a plan for dealing with the backlash because it's coming. $125 a barrel oil buys a lot of weapons and so on and so on and so on, and we're going to wake up. The Washington Post just a couple days ago had a story about there are 40 countries with nuclear programs now, some of which will inevitably be weaponized. We're going to look in a world of 20 or 30 countries with nuclear weapons, and a lot of people who really hate us, and a lot of people who have a real grudge against us. And I still love my country, and I still root for us to succeed, and part of me is an American patriot on that score. But I just think most of all, what I really want to see is America defended. I do not want to see the London subway bombers or the Madrid train station bombers coming to America.
Then let's start doing things like getting decent health care for security guards. What I hear is this big inconsistency between a kind of national rhetoric of, as you say, being strong and having a sort of a country that's defending itself. On the other hand, with a reality where people are, we have a tiny percentage of our country actually serving in the military. Where we had at our church the other day a group of private security workers who don't get health care, who get a paltry minimum wage, and are expected to support their families. Let's look at the state of,
I agree.
our of the basic safety net of our societies. The number I don't think it's unconnected to a faulty foster care system, 1 in 8 Americans living in poverty, a kind of crumbling sense of what it means to be an American and have a responsibility for the whole of our citizenry. And
I agree. I agree. Listen, I completely agree. I think everybody should have health care. I think everybody should have a good school to go to. I think what can I say? I think that part of defending a nation is a citizenry, and I'll come back to that word in a second, that feels that they've got a stake in the system, that they've been treated well, that there's a sense of fairness and equity, including income distribution and so on, that makes people feel like they're a part of this. Now, I would say this, though, and that is that you can't have a welfare state the way that, in the good sense of welfare, as in like just promoting the general welfare as opposed to dependency and so on, with open borders. That you cannot run a welfare state for the world. You have to have some sense of, look, this package of benefits goes to citizens. You can't come here illegally and collect on this kind of stuff, because not only will you bankrupt the country, but you'll also end the kind of communal feeling that comes from, to use your example again, the Afghan imam who's ministering not only to Afghans but also Nigerians and whoever else he was dealing with, because that's exactly the sort of the knitting together of people of different ethnicities and so on into the same culture. That's the very thing that enables the kind of communitarian welfare state thinking to arise, is when you feel connected to people. And history tells us pretty decisively that if you're trying to run a welfare state for strangers, it will collapse.
But can we just, for a second, sticking on the subject of immigration, actually look at the lives of people who are, the majority of people who are illegal immigrants in this country? I don't see, whereas I know that there's a much touted myth out there in terms of, people coming over the border and collecting, but the actual lives of people, if you looking around at who do you actually know? People are exhausted from the number of hours that they work. The strawberries that you eat for dinner, the strawberries that I eat for dinner, the food that I get, off the supermarket, those are picked by people who, by and large, many of them are illegal. Most of the benefits that so how I understand what you're saying about, on the one hand, the sense that resources are not unlimited, but on the other hand, who are the people that are actually working to produce many of the resources that we enjoy? A lot of them, a substantial amount, are from undocumented workers who are here to try to create better lives for themselves.
Well, I think they should be documented, and frankly, I think in many cases, this the whole sort of definition of progress over the last few hundred years has been to replace manual labor, the kind of backbreaking labor that nobody wants to do if they can possibly afford otherwise, with machines. The reason we haven't automated, raspberry picking and strawberry picking and so on is because we haven't had to, because the various lobbies, including the sort of multiculturals on the left and big business on the right, have conspired pretty overtly to keep an open spigot of immigration coming to the country as a way of providing cheap farm workers in California and wherever else, and truck farming and wherever else. So what we should do is have invested in our own people in terms of automation, so that the strawberries get picked by machine, just like we did with wheat 150 years ago with the McCormick Reaper. We could have had the same progress going on ever since. It's what the Japanese are doing. And I think it's a guarantee that you're going to have a very, very income unequal, wildly striated Brazil-like country if you have a third world industry like labor-intensive agriculture in amidst your first world economy. And my answer is not have the third world economy in your country.
But when you say us, as in we Americans, I'm curious how your argument differs from somebody who was, promoting a kind of nativist stance at the turn of the century, or somebody who didn't like the Japanese when they were arriving in the post-1965 change of immigration laws. Or any other wave of a kind of a conservative reaction to what has in fact built this country, which is people from other countries.
Well, that's true. But built this country, I believe, is immigrants who patriotically assimilated and who learned English and are now intermarried all across various ethnic groups and religions and so on and so on. And that's been the great achievement of this country, that we never had the kind of Protestant Catholic strife. There was plenty, of course, but we never had it compared to Europe, that's for sure. And we've never had the kind of ethnic civil wars that other countries get, because we did this on the whole with a lot of mistakes and tragedies and frankly evil in some cases, like slavery. But we didn't. You learn from those things and you say, listen, we Americans are going to make. And by the way, we can have elections on this. I think that anybody who thinks that immigration is not a hot issue only needs to remember the immigration bill last summer. Where the elites were pretty much united on the value of a comprehensive immigration bill, and they got clobbered by radio talk show hosts. And of course, in addition to the radio talk show hosts, the U.S. Senate. Eliot Spitzer, your former governor up there in New York, had the bright idea of trying to give driver's license to illegal aliens. And he got his head handed to him before, of course, long before any of the scandal stuff. In other words, the American people just won't allow the kind of multicultural, we are the world kind of project that many on the left espouse, and frankly, many on the left should wake up and realize that if the things they really care about for America, like a social safety net and some sense of equality and participation and civic virtue, that you're going to have to do. You can only do that with citizens who have sort of sworn an oath to have some commitment to each other. You just don't see that in Brazil or Lebanon or places like that. You only see it in relatively cohesive countries. That's just sort of axiomatic around the world.
Yeah. Again, I want to think of I'd be curious to see your response to a encounter that we have here sometimes at the Interfaith Center, again, working with immigrant or sometimes disenfranchised religious groups. And we had a roundtable discussion here on Judaism and geopolitics with a bunch of judges from the Brooklyn Supreme Court. Now, what the discussion ended up being was actually about jury duty. And this, I think, is interesting because this is exactly the sort of thing that I assume you mean when you say a swearing an oath of allegiance to one another. Assuming that, as Americans, one thing that we owe each other in the country is to serve on a jury of our peers, right? Or to step up to jury duty. And one of the things that came out in this discussion was, well, for some of the Jewish Orthodox communities in Brooklyn, where there, as you may know, are about almost a dozen rabbinical courts where issues of dispute that don't have to be resolved in secular or regular courts can be resolved within those rabbinical courts. So it's a place where these questions that you're discussing are really tested. Now, the judge gets up at one point and says, "Listen, I'm constitutionally mandated to make sure that we have a diverse jury pool. And this is tough, particularly when it comes to recognizing the Sabbath observances of many of our Orthodox religious groups. And you have a question of a member of an Orthodox community who needs to observe the Sabbath on a Friday. And the rabbinical representative for that community talked about the importance of having a couple hours earlier in the day Friday to be able to go home and to prepare the house for the bringing into the Sabbath, and how needing to get out a few hours early on Fridays sometimes meant that they couldn't attend the full-on, jury duty selection process, and they couldn't be considered. So then the administrative judge says, well, listen, that's a great thing to know. If it's the difference between getting out at, 11 o'clock than 5 o'clock, maybe that's something we can work with. And there's a back and forth that goes on there. Well, I think that's a totally critical conversation, and it's one that we need to have more often. And it's one where I think on the outside you might look at this community and say, oh, well, this is an un-American sort of thing. But the fact is, is it that's really getting out of jury duty? If you look at the sort of statistics, it's not the kind of the ethnic or oddball, religious group, as it were, the recent immigrants. It's people who are wealthy and who are working jobs that enable them to get out of jury duty. So if you want to look at things like that, I would say that's the real litmus test of what it means to be American.
That's a good one. I agree. I completely agree. Look, these issues of religious practice, you can make a general rule and say, look, this is what we're going to strive for. And then you can always find, and I think legitimately, up to a point, exceptions. I think kids in public schools should say the Pledge of Allegiance, for example. But I realize that the Seventh-day Adventists, I think, if I remember properly, or the Jehovah's Witnesses, sued and they got some Supreme Court decision. You can deal with little exceptions as long as the general rule and entry into the proper mainstream of American politics and American life depends on conforming to those things. A good example that I've read about, and I'm not, again, you're much closer to these kind of intriguing little details than I am, is how the Sikhs have handled like being cops and so on. Mm-hmm. The rule, as I understand it, and please correct me if I'm wrong, as I've just read this in the New York Times. Of course, I believe everything I read in the Times.
Right.
That the Sikhs, of course, have to wear a turban, above when they hit puberty. And but of course the New York City cops say, look, you got to wear your police hat. And so the compromise they reach, which I think is brilliant, is that the Sikhs wear a little tiny turban, a little symbolic turban, and then they put their hat on top of that. Now that to me is a good way of communicating, both one's religious freedom and one's religious identity with the need to, look at the police succeed in the same way the army succeeds, and for that matter, security guards succeed, is when they have a certain esprit de corps that comes from not only having spiffy uniforms, but also being paid decently, going back to your point about the security guards who aren't getting health care and so on. If you want people to do dirty, dangerous jobs, you have to treat them with some respect, and that doesn't just mean salutes and ceremonies, it also means a living wage, health care, so on and so on. So these are fascinating questions about how one does create, and I certainly agree, a place like Brooklyn, which probably has 150 ethnic groups, you want to have a jury that includes all those people, and you have to figure out some way to get them there.
And I think it also goes back to where does one direct one's ire about being un-American? And I think we have a national sense of identity that's not perhaps matched with the reality of or who are the Americans and who are the un-Americans on the ground. Because, again, if you look at not just, who pastes the American flags on their windows and as you say, do the outward sort of symbols of nationalistic sentiment, but who is it that's putting aside the time to actually serve their country? I'm not sure it breaks down along the lines of who was physically born in the U.S. or has lived here for long and several generations versus those who came from overseas.
I'm not sure it does, but I will say this, and again, this is just the political scientist in me, going back to the Greeks, the ancient Greeks, you should fight your wars with citizens. Not mercenaries and not people you've imported. Look, all the neocons have great grand plans for importing the population of Latin America to go fight in Iraq. And one of the reasons they want to do that is because they know that in America, relatively few people will complain if we're fighting wars with the American version of the French Foreign Legion. So one of the genius wisdoms of the founders of the American Revolutionary era, who were paying close attention to all the accumulated political science of their predecessors across the ages, was one of the limiting factors on the bellicosity of your government is the realization you're going to have to fight it with your small r Republican army, and so and they will force you to be stingy in your overseas grandiloquence if they not only can vote and get to vote you out of office, but if there is a war, by definition they're the only ones available to fight. Now, this is still for any discussion of balance of power and so on and so on, but in the end, a major check on the natural, glory lust of politicians is, hey, look, the citizenry will vote you out of office if you try it.
Great. So where does that leave us with private contractors, out of curiosity?
I'm against them. Mm-hmm. I think, again, if we like the military, and we think the military is necessary, however we say it, I just don't think that we should, in the Blackwaters of the world. It's like the Jehovah's Witnesses. Sometimes I could see some example somewhere where it is more valuable to keep a kind of murkiness as to who's doing what and so on, just for reasons of statecraft. But the idea that the State Department needs Blackwater, I find ridiculous. I find absurd and dangerous and counterproductive, and a thwarting of thousands of years of sort of military sociology that says that all the soldiers in a war zone ought to be in the same basic status, not with playing by different rules, subject to the uniform code of military justice in the case of the United States. And again, I think if you do that, you have just a much better morale. I mean, part of the problem we have is that, and again, this is part of the challenge of running an experiment, of fighting a war the way we're fighting it, with lots of contractors and lots of a kind of abstraction from the average American. Is that in fact you don't fight very well. Mm-hmm. It's not like we're doing a great job in Iraq overall. It's not like we won World War II in 3.5 years, or in Europe at least, and here we are still struggling in Iraq 5+ years later.
Yeah, it's a bit grim.
It's a bit grim, and again, the kind of people, going back to my Isaiah Berlin counter-Enlightenment argument, the kind of people who are getting in the neck, I won't say the most, but more than most in these places are like the remnant Christian populations in Iraq, the Copts in Egypt, and what remains of the Christian population in Lebanon. I suspect are all going to come under enormous stress to the point of, I think, being eliminated. I mean, it doesn't mean they'll all be killed, but they might have to be refugees somewhere. That's part of the inevitable backlash process that we set in motion.
And I think that, again, we didn't do them any favors, particularly when it comes to the Christian community in Iraq. I think that the initial attempts to have some of the, the more openly conservative and evangelical aid groups in there doing rebuilding reinforced this idea that we were, trying to attack Islam and its roots, and wreaked havoc, actually, with a long sort of agreed upon interfaith, relationship between Christians, Muslims of all kinds in that part of the world. And that, and that was a particularly sad outset of us, country that believes that, however we identify, coming in there with, our so-called, the imagery that was used anyway, which was, I would say, thinly disguised Christian triumphalism, goes in there and does a really desperate job on the indigenous Christians that actually live there. And
I agree. I agree completely. Which again goes back to the illustration of the challenge to figure out is, okay, look, all through the New Testament is evangelize, preach to the nations. Just almost be kind of reckless and radical almost in the way that you proclaim your faith to the rest of the, to everybody else. Okay, that's the New Testament, and that's that prophetic, visionary tradition, if you will. But practical experience tells you sometimes you have to think it through better than that. You need, again, light of faith, light of reason. You need both, and something says, look, if the last, like the Crusades, for example. The Muslim, when the Muslims took over the Middle East in the 7th century, they were pretty much content to just make all the Christian. These places were pretty much Christian prior, of course, to the rise of Islam in the 7th century, and the Muslims were pretty much content to leave the Christian populations in Lebanon and Turkey and Syria and elsewhere pretty much alone. They paid the tax, and that was that. The Crusaders showed up, and
many
when the
of
Muslims
whom were mercenaries, right? Fourth Crusade.
Pardon?
Many of whom were mercenaries.
Well, but many of them were zealots. But the
Right.
point is, but the point is, when they came, and when they're ultimately driven out in I guess by the 13th century or so, then Islam launched on a major campaign of purification, because they said, look, we've seen that the Christians were frankly kind of like collaborators, and we now see the value of a Muslim population. And so the Christians suffered enormously and were pretty much eliminated as a force in all these countries except for Lebanon, I suppose, thereafter. So in other words, again, let's learn from the past, folks. Let's learn history and say certain things are inevitable, and if you rile the hornet's nest of the Muslim majority in, say, Iraq, long after you get tired of stirring the pot and sticking them in the eye sticking your stick in the bee's nest, the people who are going to get stung the most are your fellow Christians who are, getting knocked off all the time now. There, and again, I predict that most of them will wind up in Detroit or Paris or somewhere else other than Iraq when all is said and done.
I think you're right about that.
Okay. And maybe New York City. Who knows? In any case,
Okay.
Chloe,
Yeah.
it's been great talking to you. I wish you the best. I very much admire those who are willing to live by their faith and to actually get out there among real people and try and solve these problems and learn from them, because that's exactly what Jesus would have done and did do, and would do if he were with us today. Although I believe in spirit he is. And I think, but at the same time, I'll say that I think there is some value in studying history with an eye toward a plan for preserving our freedom to be Christians or non-Christians, as our conscience tells us to be.
Well, thank you so much, Jim. This has been great, and look forward to talking to you again sometime.
I'm sure we will.
Very
Thanks,
good.
Chloe. Bye-bye.